Come. So hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. My name is Victoria Herman. I am an assistant research professor at Georgetown University, and I am the principal investigator of the Migration in Harmony Research Coordination Network, which is running this webinar. The Migration in Harmony Research Coordination Network is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's a 3-year initiative that hopes to bring people together across the social, natural sciences, humanities, traditional knowledge holders, cultural heritage workers, public health workers, to discuss and move towards collective solutions on an Arctic in motion. We look at shifting ecosystems and species, but also shifting disaster risk, which is what we will be focusing on today. Before I hand it over to Dr. Chad Briggs, a co-PI of the Research Coordination Network, I'll just give a few housekeeping tips. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to go up to the top right corner of your Zoom and move to speaker mode instead of gallery mode. That will position the camera on whoever is speaking, me now, but then Dr. Briggs, so that you can get a full view of the lecture. We will not be sharing a screen throughout this presentation. Instead, Dr. Briggs has provided slides, which I am currently sharing in the chat. These slides are notes throughout the presentation. They're not necessary to view, but they are helpful text and visual additions to what Dr. Briggs will be saying. This webinar will be recorded and put up on YouTube in a few days. So if you have to leave early, no worries. We will be sending out via email a link to that YouTube recording. And finally, after the presentation, which will take about 30 to 45 minutes, we will open up to a question and answer session. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to wait until then to ask a question. If you have a pressing question, please put it in the chat box that I will be monitoring throughout. We'll take a few-minute break in the middle of Dr. Briggs' presentation to check on any pressing questions that have been asked throughout the first half, so that we make sure that we are responding and are being a little more interactive than just a full-on lecture. Once Dr. Briggs finishes the presentation, we will open the floor to anyone who wants to ask a question or provide a short comment. You could either type that in the chat box and I will ask it, or you can raise your hand by clicking on the participant list and then just clicking the raise hand button so that I can unmute you. And you can ask your question either over the phone or through the putting your video on. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to type them in the chat. But without further ado, I am going to hand it over to my good friend, colleague, and co-PI, Dr. Chad Briggs. Dr. Briggs is the Director of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and he specializes in translating really complex scientific data into risk assessments and strategic planning, which is what he'll share with you today. In the last few years, he has focused on hybrid warfare and cyber operations based in Kosovo and Ukraine. And previously, he was the Minerva Chair of Energy and Environmental Security at Air University of the United States Air Force. So I'm going to leave it at that, so we have plenty of time to listen to Chad's expertise and to engage in a fruitful and in-depth conversation thereafter. So Chad, take it away.
All right, thank you, Victoria. I really appreciate the collaboration leadership of Dr. Herman. I've known her for about 11 years now. And it's, I think what we find ourselves in right now when she asked me to do a webinar on disasters wasn't just because much of my research does focus on disasters, but because we find ourselves in the middle of one. And it's a strange situation that on the one hand, we can hold webinars like this that we're finding a new normal for interaction within our community. But at the same time, this will pose challenges for us. And that's one of the issues that I'm going to get to in a bit, about how it is that we can coordinate, how we can build trust, and how we cooperate when, in many cases, we won't be able to see each other except through video links. Now, I did say, well, as Dr. Herman said, I'm not gonna put up slides. I think that's rather awkward on Zoom. So I will just be talking, but you have the link to the PowerPoint slides. I will be going through them, and I will give you some indication, as if we're in a sort of first grade storybook read along, about which slide I'm on. In part, there are some important visuals, but I also just wanted to get some definitions down so that we're all on the same page. And I can start with the second slide in talking about what is a disaster. Now, disaster is not something that I've talked about in terminology for much of my career. I started in the more hard security field. I originally did genocide studies, which arguably is perhaps the most extreme form of disaster that we can really imagine. But that also led me to understand that disasters are not necessarily natural, that we understand disasters because we look at them as humans, because they affect communities, because they affect things that are valuable to us. That, as the philosophical idea would go, if a tree falls in the forest and no one sees it, well, that's not a disaster because it just doesn't matter to us as humans. We can try for the more ecocentric views, but ultimately it comes down to the idea of a calamitous event, something that overwhelms the ability of a system, whether it's an ecosystem, a social system, economic, military, computer, in which that system is unable to respond to the shock, and which it is overwhelmed according to whatever vulnerabilities exist in that system. Now, of course, you can have combinations of this. That, for example, for those of you who are Americans on this call, you understand this is July tax day. And for those who were at the University of Alaska and trying to get hold of your W-2s on the computerized system in the last few days, that system wasn't working. Now, this creates a bit of a crisis for all of us, right? But it's a combination of events, things that we don't plan for, but at the same time are intersecting with one another in ways that suddenly cause enormous stress and may outpace our ability to adjust to it. Now, there's a joke that when people in England start speeches, they often start with a joke. I'm Canadian educated, so I have to start with an apology. If any of this seems repetitive, because I've seen, at least from scanning on this, that there are colleagues in Boulder and Fairbanks, and at least one former student in Anchorage. If I'm repeating anything, I do apologize in advance. It's difficult to get across all of these concepts, and I will be doing sort of broad brushstrokes. But it's important because many of these ideas lay the groundwork for how the three of us, when we were coming up with this NSF proposal, understood the idea of overwhelming environmental forces. And it's not, again, to say that it's simply the natural world that's impinging upon us as humans, but rather it's the interaction that's important. Now, the second point here is that disasters are not always a surprise, although it does help. Meaning if people are surprised by events, they're less likely to be able to respond to them. Now, there are ways to anticipate, and these are some of the methodologies that I'm going to try to explain a little bit and that we will be incorporating into our research network. But sometimes we do know they're coming. Sometimes perhaps there are policies and whole playbooks laid out for how to respond to a pandemic, and we don't respond to it perhaps as well as some others might. It partly depends upon political decisions that we make, what we value, what it is that we want to see have happen. And it's those decisions that are also important. So the second part of what we try to do in this research network is to look at not just what might happen in the natural world, what geophysical events might happen, how they intersect with the human world, with our infrastructure, with our social systems, but also what decisions we make when we're faced with these. So if we're faced with a warning of an impending hazard, how do we respond to that? Now, next on the slide, I'll talk a little bit about terminology, very briefly. Now, we do discuss this a bit more in our book, and I do put a plug for that in one of the later slides. But this differs a bit between different fields. So if I talk to people who are talking about coastal hazards, their idea of what vulnerability means can be different from how I use it or how I understand it. My understanding came largely from both security studies and from the biological sciences. So when I look at vulnerability, we'll look at 4 different components. There's the exposure, first of all. If you're exposed to a hazard, whether it's a poison like arsenic, whether it's too much sunlight, whether it's too much water, too much of something, how much someone is exposed is a component of that risk. But it also depends upon how sensitive a system or a person is to that. We all understand that people have different sensitivity to different sorts of environmental stimuli. And it's the same for communities, it's the same for political systems, it's the same for infrastructure. The same wave height hitting a beach is going to affect one beach differently than another, either because of geography, because of geology, because of how things are built, a number of factors. And there's also the concept of resilience. Now, resilience is understood differently between the biological sciences and psychology. Psychology tends to talk about resilience as the ability to withstand change. And they'll talk about this, for example, in the COVID pandemic, as the ability to maintain your even straight, the ability to maintain your cool while you're stuck at home with kids and you're trying to work at the same time and you're trying to hold a video conference and your cat walks in front of the video. Biological sciences would look at the ability to bounce back. That would be, if a forest burns down, then does it grow back? And in many biological systems, this sort of resilience is expected, that things aren't static, that they're not expected to change. And we could think about this psychologically as well, that perhaps resilience is understanding that, yes, we're gonna go back and we're gonna binge watch 4 seasons of Unreal on Netflix, and then we'll respond and be more productive the next month. And we could talk about ourselves in terms of how resilient we are to changing conditions then. That yes, we're gonna have to adapt. Yes, we're gonna have bad days. Yes, we're gonna be less productive as academics during this pandemic, but can we bounce back? And then there's the concept of fragility, that sometimes when systems are pushed too much, when they're pushed too far, if they're too brittle, they will break. This is both an engineering concept, but it also exists in some cases in the complexity sciences, that if you push a system too far, it will resort to a different level of complexity. It may still be stable, but it will have less complexity. It will not work in the same way that it did before. Communities can sometimes exist like this. I don't personally know New Orleans very well, but everyone had said that New Orleans was not the same city after Hurricane Katrina that it was before. So when we're looking at vulnerability, we try to look into the future and figure out where are the vulnerable spots in a system. What are we going to be exposed to? What is going to overwhelm our ability to adapt? What might be more sensitive to? And are there fragile systems that could simply break and need to be protected? This is a difference, however, between foresight and prediction. And it's an important distinction. Prediction implies that we know what's going to happen in the future, that it's a set future and that we know what it's going to be. Foresight, in contrast, is the ability to look into the future and see different potential futures, understanding that, one, how we understand the current situation, our mind maps, everything will affect our decisions. And also those decisions will then affect what the course of the future will be. So with foresight, we can pick a future and we can either say, this is the future that we want, and then work back and say, how do we work towards that? Or we can say, this is a future we definitely don't want. And so what would be the steps that would lead us there? And then how can we find an alternate path to get off of this? So on the next slide, we can talk about Arctic examples, and there are many of these. And I'll start with the idea of colonialism as a background to disaster itself. When I started studying in Canada, this was in the 1990s during many of the court settlements in cases about residential schooling. And so my understanding of much of what happened in the Arctic with indigenous peoples, and we'd seen some of the same in Norway with my work at the Sami, was that the introduction of European colonialism, of pandemic diseases, of residential schooling, of resource extraction, of different shocks to culture and to livelihood, these themselves were both triggers to disasters themselves. We can talk about the experience in Alaska in 1918 and 1919 of the influenza, or it set the conditions for those communities to be less resilient for future disasters. And that also comes from my work in post-conflict reconstruction. What we often found was that actions were often taken, what we call resilience targeting, that would deliberately try to undermine the ability of the community to rebuild after the conflict was over. But we see the same thing and the same dynamics often happening with disasters, that sometimes deliberate actions will be taken, either intentionally or not, but that will eventually lead to a community being less able to respond to some sort of disaster in the future. And we can have natural hazards. Hazards meaning those are things which are natural occurrences and which could potentially pose risks to us. Some of these are completely natural. Wildfires, flooding, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, these things do happen naturally. But increasingly what we're finding is that they are climate related, that we have drier conditions, we're going to have more wildfires, that we have changes to precipitation, there could be more flooding. And we can even, and I'll get to this in a second, find links between climate change and tsunamis. And then there are the more obvious mechanized or man-made disaster, and I say man-made because it's usually men who are responsible. Oil spills, radiation leaks, deforestation, and in the Arctic, you can even go back to really iconic events such as a large cruise liner leaving England and hitting an iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic. These things are visible, but you also have to understand the background context behind which these happen. In other words, in the photo that I put up on the PowerPoint, and you see the very recent oil spill that's happened in the northern Russian city of Norilsk, you have to ask, why is Norilsk there in the first place? And it has to do with Soviet ideas of resource extraction, of mining, of creating an Arctic city that is completely cut off from the rest of the world. And the environmental conditions there and environmental regulations then can only be understood in that context. So on the next slide, we can also mention emerging trends. And in this sense, we talk about climate change really as a driver, meaning it is not a singular variable that we can talk about. Climate change means many different things. Most people often refer to it in terms of average high daytime temperatures, air temperatures in the troposphere, but it means many more things than that. It means changes to precipitation. It means average changes to sea surface temperature. It means changes to nighttime high temperatures. And it pushes the boundaries of resilience because it means that it's pushing ecosystems, social systems, economic systems, livelihoods into directions that they're simply not able to cope anymore. If we lose the sea ice, then this undercuts the ability of certain villages to be able to hunt certain species which underpin their livelihood. And so even though if it's only one particular change, the ripple effects, the cascading effects from this have to be understood in terms of the interconnections. And we can sometimes even map these networks of how closely intertwined and how nested they are within one another. And let me just give an example of our current situation in Alaska. So we know that glacier retreat happens. Sometimes it happens naturally, but we're seeing much more of it because of climate changes. About 100 kilometers northeast of Anchorage, there's a glacier called Berry. The Berry Glacier has been receding, and because it's been receding, then it undercuts the mountainside that normally was resting on top of part of the glacier, the process known as debuttressing. And now that the glacier isn't there, this mountainside has started moving. And it's about 1.5 by 1.5 kilometers in size. It's quite large. And so if you took an entire mass, if this were to suddenly fall into the Berry Arm Fjord, it would create an enormous tsunami, which would go down Prince William Sound and eventually curve around and create a 10-meter tsunami to hit the village of Whittier. This is quite serious, and we as some scientists have been trying to warn the state, warn the federal government, and they've taken this quite seriously. But we don't really know how to respond to it yet. When we have these new and emerging issues, the National Tsunami Warning Center is very serious about this, but tsunami warnings are based on earthquakes, not landslides. And we don't really have good monitoring capabilities. And what does a monitoring or a warning system even sound like for Whittier? What does it mean for that town? And when you think of a town like Whittier, what does it even mean when you have people from the outside, whether it's in Juneau or Washington, DC, or in Anchorage, making decisions based upon how they understand that the town works. One person may see it as an alternate port town for the municipality of Anchorage. Some people see it as a fishing base. Some people see it as a tourist destination. But for some people, it's their home. And their definition of what it means to be in that community is very important. But it's very difficult as well to sort of piece apart if you have to make decisions to move it, if you have to make decisions to keep tourists out or to scale back on fishing, there are very real consequences to that. And what we want to do is to set up a process by which people can contribute to this discussion rather than simply being handed a warning and saying, here, this is something you should worry about, you guys figure it out. We're the scientists, you're the politicians, it's not our thing. There needs to be more interaction. And I think I'm going to go in just a minute to try and talk about what that process looks like. But can we take a break just for a second? I've been keeping the chat window closed, so I'm not distracted by it. Okay, but if no one has any hugely pressing questions, and no one's waving at me that I'm not being heard or not being seen. So the next slide, there are two photos here. And these are meant to provide a juxtaposition from some of my experience in the last few years in Southeastern Europe, specifically dealing with Syrian, Iraqi, Afghan, other refugees in northern Greece. And the idea of migration, of refugees, this is a very political concept, as I'm sure all of you understand, because migration in one sense is a natural adaptation. Animals normally can migrate. Birds certainly migrate. There can be slow-paced migration if climate changes shift biomes, and then you have different plants that can exist in different areas. But when humans try to move, they come up against these artificial borders. And whether they're hard state borders, which in the case of between Greece and North Macedonia were very real and very hard, or you can have the case of the other photos of Newtok, Alaska, where the barriers are much more political, economic, and social. Because even if the town understands that their village cannot stay in the same place, to move it, you have to raise all sorts of questions about who pays for this, who decides where it goes, who decides how to obtain property of where the new village goes. How do you transport an entire community from one place to another? What is important to preserve and what gets left behind? Now, these are questions that I would say Dr. Herman is more of the expert on, but they're important questions that we have to think about in terms of disaster, because it's not simply a matter of adapting. And sometimes you can't simply mitigate, you can't simply reduce the risk. In those cases, we have to ask larger questions, and that's why we're constructing this research network, because we need people from around the North who can help answer these questions for us. And on the next slide, some of these ideas then come from our experience, meaning my teams working in the intelligence and military fields. And let me just give a short caveat here. I know that many people will have suspicions about the motivations behind what the military and intelligence communities are doing. Those are well justified. And I'm not saying that those are the organizations best designed to deal with these situations. Rather, what we tried to do is to communicate what are the tools and the methodologies that we learned from working with these agencies. And how can we transpose these into either universities, into nonprofits, because universities aren't often the best places either. We have problems in terms of, well, I won't get into all of that quite yet. Let's just say the different organizations have different problems. And when we try to create these complex disaster scenarios, and when I say complex, meaning we're not trying to look at just one hazard at a time. We're not trying to stovepipe expertise and say that we're only going to look at glacier retreat here, or we're only going to look at wildfires in this area. But rather, it's the concept of what if they combine? What if we have combinations of these different factors? Because what we found in the past was that if you take, for example, aviation disasters are never simply one thing happening. I won't say never. I mean, you can have like the Lockerbie bombing or one major catastrophe. But oftentimes it's a combination of small things. And any one of those things individually, someone can look at that and say, I can handle that. But pilot training goes back to try to teach pilots to look at the entire spectrum and to say, oh, okay, I can handle this, but taken together, this is a real problem. This is an emergency. And I thought we needed to do that as well with disaster studies, that if we only looked at one risk, and if we tried to look historically and say that, well, we really haven't historically had many hurricanes hitting New York City, so let's not worry about it. And that's what I had people tell me when we were trying to warn them about the risk before Hurricane Sandy occurred. So not to get stuck on probabilities, but to understand that our futures can be as complex or even more complex and more scary than we imagined. At one point, we were trying to explain why we needed to think about tsunami risks at the same time a pandemic was happening. And people sort of brushed us off and said, well, come on, that's not going to happen. You're just pushing it too far. But now we find ourselves in a situation in which, say in Alaska, we have a pandemic occurring. We have social unrest throughout the United States. And if any new disaster occurs, and we tried modeling this a bit with my students at UAA last month, and it was scary. It was scary because you have a combination of factors of, for example, Alaska Air has to scale back its flight operations. The airline Raven Air has gone bankrupt and many of its assets have been sold off to California. And so flights are simply not going to the native villages or to the rural villages. The Maritime Highway, the ferry system, is not operating the way it should. And so while, because of COVID, they want to be cut off, at the same time, they are cut off in case anything bad happens. And we have very little capacity here in Alaska to deal with these sorts of emergencies. So although it's fairly quiet up here at the moment, it's the underlying sort of weak signals that we get about slight upticks here and there, about knowing that there's community spread in the village of Nome, of knowing that these things can get much worse. And so what we try to do is to insert this knowledge either into models that we can construct where we look at the extremes, that's known as n-dimensional modeling for scenarios. Look at the different boundaries of extremities. I'm doing this 3-dimensionally, but technically you can do it in as many as 8 dimensions. We come up with workshop constructions. This is a technique that we will be using with the RCN. And we can use wargame layers. Now again, the term wargame is often disliked by people, but it does have a specific terminological use, and it refers to leading people through a simulation where they play the role of different groups that have to make decisions about how to respond to different situations. And what we've done in the past, the military would sometimes put layers in, which is to say that they're still focused on the traditional military combat, but suddenly they have to deal with environmental issues in addition to everything else, which impinges upon their operational abilities. But we've also done pure disaster scenarios in which people have to understand that the resources are constrained, that sometimes the military does have a role in trying to do disaster response, but ultimately it's the political decisions that are important. And what are those decisions? What are the things we have to decide? What do we not know? When do you have to make decisions? And from that, we can develop playbooks where we can say, okay, under these conditions, if a new earthquake occurs in Anchorage, these are the things we have to take into account, especially given the current pandemic, the economics, the social unrest, all of these other factors that are hitting us right now. So on the next slide, it's the idea of workshop constructions. We create workshops in which we get groups of different experts together. And Dr. Herman had the amazingly good idea of taking our ingredients, what we call driver cards, and having the experts themselves write them. What we've tried to do, starting at Department of Energy and then with the Air Force, was to avoid black boxing scenarios, of having a situation in which you have experts sit in a room somewhere and write up a future scenario and then simply hand it to others and say, look, this is the scenario you have to deal with. What do you do? The problem with that, and this goes back to business administration, well, business leadership literature from the 1970s, Pierre Bach and Shell Oil. And again, Shell Oil not being your best partner necessarily in the Arctic, but we can learn lessons. That if you simply hand, as experts, a potential future to someone else, they will tend to disbelieve it if they don't like it. If it doesn't fit their narrative, if it doesn't fit the story, like we discussed in the past webinar. If it doesn't fit a sort of understanding of how the world should work, they will discount it unless they were involved in creating the scenario. And then they will own it. Then they will try to figure out how best we could work through it and what more needs to be known. We did start experimenting with developing the cards with the experts themselves. That was one thing that we black boxed in the past. And you can see on the next slide 2 examples of the Carrington Effect, which is a solar storm, and of Arctic volcanic eruptions. This is what they essentially look like. They're not so much cards as letter A4 sized. The idea behind them was that rather than looking at, as I said, single variable hazards, where you're looking only at a volcanic eruption and then how do you respond to the volcanic eruption, but understanding that volcanic eruption could happen at the same time as a solar storm, at the same time that you have intense flooding, at the same time that there are things happening outside the Arctic, which at first glance doesn't look like it's important, but really does affect what's happening. So for example, when last month we were looking at a disaster scenario for Alaska, we had to understand that what happened in the lower 48 really affected what was going on in Alaska, because most of our supplies came from the lower 48 states. We had intense fuel supply shortages. We had food shortages. We had medical supply issues. Everything had been cut off because all of the logistics trains, 90% of those supplies go through the port of Anchorage. The port of Anchorage in the scenario was damaged. The port of Whittier was damaged. The airports had been damaged, and many of the airlines had been undercut. So when we started looking holistically at how all of these things fit together, we understood that there were a lot of vulnerabilities that were being exploited, overwhelmed, that normally we wouldn't think of. But now we have to step back and understand, okay, these are things that we need to invest in. These are areas that either we need to research more as scientists, or these are areas where either the government, the military, whoever is responsible has to increase resilience in some ways. Those become important political questions, but as long as we're able to ask them in advance, that's much better than trying to respond after the fact. So the philosophy behind this is to understand if we're going to get hit with disasters, and if in this research network we look at the sorts of disasters, whether they're slow burn or whether they're abrupt, then what are the sort of issues that we need to look at in terms of what constitutes a healthy community, what forces people to pick up and have to migrate from one place to another. And then if people have to migrate, what are the sorts of policies that need to be put into place to ensure that this does not damage these communities, or that they can, you know, whether they want to be integrated into a new community, whether they need to be preserved someplace else. These are questions that should be asked in advance. And what we're finding increasingly is that we have situations like with Barry Arm and the village of Whittier, which, okay, admittedly is below the Arctic Circle, but it's still north. But it's an example of questions that sometimes we're going to have to ask, because what if there are similar landslide hazards that exist elsewhere in the Arctic? And we know they do exist, but we only just happen to stumble across this one. Now we need to look out and scan and see, are there other villages that we need to tell them it's not safe to live there anymore? There were some examples from Norway, from Greenland, and we just need to find out, you know, again, this is a single hazard. But if we can identify these, and if we can come up with plausible scenarios for the future, if we can start planning for this in advance, then it's much easier to raise the questions about what uncertainties exist, what political questions need to be asked, and what we as researchers or as local stakeholders need to contribute to the discussion. I did put on the slide number 10, a plug for the book that we wrote last year. That's myself and Miri Matejova. Again, this was not a sort of hoorah, the military was great. It was a retrospective of the lessons that were learned from working with the intelligence community and with the US military, and what could be, whether tricks, methodologies, tools that could be applied then to the larger environmental community. So with that, Victoria, I think if we could turn to questions, if anyone has them, I wanted to leave enough time.
Great. Well, please join me in giving a virtual round of applause for that incredibly insightful presentation by Dr. Briggs. And we will use the remainder of time, which is about 50 minutes, to have a discussion. We have a few questions off the bat in our chat. Please continue to use the chat to type your questions or to raise your hand by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. To start us off, we have a question from Priya asking if you and your students look at the tropical storms and cyclones that have been happening during the pandemic to help model tsunami risk.
We were certainly aware of them. So what was happening in places like India and Bangladesh, and we'd been looking at this, there was actually a scenario that we'd run last year, looking at the Western Pacific when there were typhoons hitting at the beginning of the pandemic. So yes, we do look at that. There are sometimes contradictory policies that go into place, because if you're trying to avoid a pandemic, then moving everyone into shelters it's necessary, but of course it's going to have secondary public health consequences. So yes, we did look at those, and it is a concern that exists, that if you look at a city like Miami right now, which is running out of ICU beds, this is hurricane season, and so what happens? And yeah, there are lessons from there about then what happens in places where there are even fewer resources available, such as the Arctic.
Great, thank you. We have another question from George Rowe, where he says that given that disasters are a reality, but many of our response resources and practices are reactive rather than proactive, what is your counsel regarding how to harness capabilities and funds in advance of a disaster's occurrence? And what precedents are there with respect to using maybe a reduced allowable claims cost advance approach that could yield infrastructure training or investments pre-disaster?
Well, I think the landslide tsunami is another good example of this. It's difficult to make the argument that, yes, just give us money because we're in a bad situation. The state of Alaska is going to be broke by next year. But we can definitely make the argument that putting up a monitoring warning system is a lot less expensive than trying to have people killed and having people overwhelmed by not knowing that this is happening in the first place. And there are really good economic arguments to be made that disaster mitigation is much cheaper than disaster response and reconstruction. How far successful we've been with that? Not always. And I can point to my own experience with the Air Force. We often joked that if we could help keep even one aircraft from being damaged, that we could fund our own team for about 10 years. And then we looked at what happened last year at Tyndall Air Force Base, and a whole squadron of F-22s being damaged, which was, I mean, the price tag on that was probably in the billions of dollars. In fact, the Air Force hasn't really quite admitted just what the extent of damage was. And it shouldn't have happened. That was an avoidable tragedy from a sort of aviation point of view. So no, we're not always good. And it's one thing that I do address in the book and in some of my other research is when we fail. Because sometimes we'll give warnings, like I said, with Hurricane Sandy, we gave very clear warnings ahead of time, exactly what would happen if a hurricane hit New York City, and people didn't listen to us. Outside of the New York Office of Emergency Management, people didn't want to listen to it because they just wanted to believe the historical record that these things just don't happen anymore. So it's something that we really need to address. And I think that goes into the next question that Haley.
Can I ask just a quick question, Chad?
Oh, sure, George.
Hey, this is George. So I'm just following up on that response. So thank you very much for passing that along. The question that I have is maybe not so much like a warning system investment in terms of a what if thing, et cetera, which is super important, et cetera, but trying to find things that we know are going to add value and yield benefit, not just as a just in case kind of a situation, but guaranteed this is going to help us out. And in order to fund it, we promise, if you will, we're not going to go gouge you beyond a certain thing, because we're willing to take the risk that our provisions are not adequate. It's like FEMA being involved instead of after the fact. What would it happen if you could change water systems so that they are more resilient? Things like that. Villages that have to relocate. What if we created the ability to create energy and sewer services, et cetera, infrastructures that are guaranteed to be more robust and resilient in the event of future disasters, and then others can learn from that. That's the kind of stuff I'm asking for. Is like, could we make a case for that and provide some case studies?
The Build Back Better before things happen. Yeah, they're really good, compelling arguments. I mean, we have examples my students have written about, like it makes perfect sense to set up microgrids for energy in places in the Arctic. We have islands that are so windy that, of course, it would make sense to put in wind turbines and not have it relying on diesel engines. But again, it comes back to the communication aspect that, yeah, you can put up with really good economic arguments, but politically speaking, there's still going to be an upfront cost. And people aren't very good, especially in emergency situations and in budget crises, of discounting and of trying to explain that this is going to be more expensive for you later than investing right now. And that's one of the big challenges. We managed to do it in Hawaii. Hawaii was very dependent. I mean, like 95% of energy for Oahu was created by diesel energy. But again, that came back to the military getting involved, which we don't want to have happen. Not that they shouldn't be involved, but we didn't want to swing this hard stick and say, look, you have to do this because look at the disaster consequences. But that was ultimately sort of what it came down to. And you had these roadblocks of utilities just didn't want to, it was just a problem for them, right? Or yeah, you can set up a new water system and it would make sense, but we can make that argument for Flint, Michigan for years, and no one's picked up on it yet. There are plenty of cost-effective things we could do for COVID, and we're not doing for whatever reason right now. Politics has really been infecting a lot of our ability to rationally think through these things.
Thanks. I'll follow up with you maybe offline.
Yes, and I would say, please, anyone, feel free to contact me or Victoria or Liz in terms of whatever questions you have. And but it does relate to Haley's question about the impact of news media. So I should mention that in my previous life, meaning until last year, I did teach information warfare. And so it is a big thing because we understood that not just the news media, but the social media in general, this sort of environment that we find ourselves in, people are very easily influenced by shifting information, by depending upon what information is focused on, how the story is constructed, whether it fits with their understanding of the narrative. And it's very easy to mislead people, especially certain groups of people. The only mitigating factor for social media influence during the disaster scenario we played out last month was that most of the internet was down. And so people weren't able to get onto social media in the first place. So there was a red team trying to push disinformation, but it didn't get through very much. But it is really the communication aspects of this are really worrying. Because just like anyone, strategic communication will tell you, you have to get ahead of the message. And it's very difficult to do that because it's time consuming, it's energy consuming in terms of we as academics, and many of the people here are academics, but not all of us, we're dealing with crises every day. Sometimes in our personal lives, I know it's very difficult for my students. Things just come up. Oh, I have a death in my family, something just happened. One of my friends just got sick. I don't know if I have COVID. I have to go in for a test. Dealing with student visas last week. And it means then that we lose our ability to be proactive because we're just reacting to everything that happens day by day. I would really wish for us to go back to a more boring time where we could have a longer term perspective on everything. But this is what comes out in the war games that we do year after year, is that the here and now, the things that happen today that dominate the news media, that's what the politicians have to respond to. And the long-term strategies get lost as a result of that. It's very, very difficult to train people and to keep them on task to think about the long-term consequences of decisions that are being made.
So we have maybe a 2-for-1 question from Amy and then from Sarah. So Amy wants you to discuss Cascade Events a bit more, and how could different teleconnection supply chains to Alaska create a situation where a relatively small event far away would create a collapse of food security or oil and gas production. And I think you have already done this in some of your war games. So the pandemic is clearly a demonstration of expected events, but there are expected in general. So can you think of some others on the horizon that would affect the state? And then Sarah has a question if you can talk about overwhelm vulnerabilities, and I think that might pair well with expanding on cascading events.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of small events, oftentimes when we run through these scenarios, we don't necessarily define the trigger events in advance, but we can look at the combinations of different drivers and relationships. And knowing the vulnerabilities, we can sometimes see from that yes, if there were an earthquake, if there were a fire that broke out in this one place, that this could set off a cascade of events. Sometimes we find systems that are pretty resilient, meaning that you can hit them from a number of different sides, and we could test them with multiple scenarios, and they tend to muddle through, or they can respond well. Others, and Hawaii was a good example of this, and I think in many ways, Alaska kind of models Hawaii in the same way, because you have few ports of entry. It's essentially an island. Resources are dependent upon other places. And so when we hit it with a number of different combinations of things, if we hit tropical storm and a tsunami at the same time, 2 tropical storms after one another, then you end up with the same consequences. And that in sort of complexity terms means you have a strong attractor, that things are just getting pulled towards these vulnerability points. In Alaska, that refers to a few of the airports, refers to the Port of Alaska, meaning the Port of Anchorage. And this, incidentally, even affected the military. So in that scenario, the military flights were even constricted because they simply couldn't get fuel. They had certain reserves. Food security is a huge issue, and that's across the Arctic. And the farther you get away from the centers, and I still consider Anchorage to be a center, even though we are ourselves dependent upon food imports from Spokane, Washington, from Tacoma, Washington. The farther you get away, then the more sensitive people are to those changes. So you could have an outbreak of some sort of food disease that simply cascades through the system. You could have solar events. But like I said, it's usually a combination of things. So sometimes it could be a small trigger, and it doesn't look like it's very, it's sort of incidental itself, but because everything is constructed in such a way that things start to unravel. And the more centralized the system is, and in Alaska we are very centralized, then the more difficult that becomes. Sorry, go ahead.
One of Sarah's point with overwhelm vulnerabilities was talking about community level. And Pierre, I think, also brings in something on the community level. So have you considered the impact of all Internet of Things failures because telecommunications have failed? So we've had cases, Pierre, in the Canadian Arctic and also in Alaska, where a fiber optic cable was out or you are not able to access any telecommunications. So what does that look like on a community level? And what have you seen with those type of overwhelming vulnerabilities?
It was an issue that came up with the Barry Arms tsunami because GCI, the local telecom, runs fiber optic cables in Prince William Sound, and they could easily be disrupted or severed. I think there's a new fiber optic cable that's just been put overland from the Yukon to Fairbanks, so that's a stopgap. But what we found was that, and this is a cascade from the pandemic, and some of my cyber expert colleagues have written about this, that we've become suddenly much more dependent upon telecommunications and the internet for everything, for communications, for education. And at the same time, the infrastructure hasn't really caught up yet. Plus, we're relying upon certain platforms that leave us a bit more vulnerable. That yes, I'm using Zoom right now, but I don't give them permission to interact with Google for me. And so with my students, I use different platforms. And definitely there are government agencies which aren't able to even, I think, log into this call because of that. And sometimes we're not aware of that because we're just scrambling to do what we can with what we have. But of course, if you're in Alaska Village, all your internet data comes from AT&T over the cellular network, and it costs a lot of money. And so we even have to, like going online at the University of Alaska, we have to be really careful about making low bandwidth sorts of course options available, because if they have to be all online, not everyone has equal access. And then if something happens, even like what happened in Fairbanks on Monday, there was like a small electrical fire, and then suddenly the whole network for the University of Alaska goes out. That's really consequential. And that's an accidental happening. But what we often look at, what I look at in some of my other work, are intentional denial of service attacks that can occur. And if you time them just right, the consequences of those can be extraordinarily severe, especially if you couple it with deliberate misinformation or disinformation that's put out at certain times.
So we have a question from Karen about war games. Can you point to a good resource for how to scale the war game scenario planning model for small community decision making? Tribal communities have difficult conversations in front of them if they want to stay together, but our current community planning models don't do a very good job on being realistic with funds and timing. So is there a way that your model can help in these small community decision makings?
Possibly. And I say possibly because I want to be careful. There are cultural aspects of any of this sort of planning. That we found that some of the scenario planning doesn't work as well in some cultures, and then some of the decision making doesn't work well or works exceptionally well. And it's hard to quantify that. It's hard to really put it down. I found in the Balkans, if I want to stereotype, my Albanian students were not as good at scenario planning. It just wasn't in their way of thinking to do strategic planning. But if I put them in the middle of a war game, they were extraordinarily creative and just threw themselves into it and did things that my American students would never do because the Americans were trying to follow the rules. And the point was not to necessarily follow the rules. So let me think about that. And if you can shoot me an email, because I am also connected to the sort of larger war game community. And that's a really important question I think you're asking about, what sort of models that we use to try to get people to interact in a sort of structured way, so that it's not simply everyone sitting back and telling stories and wanting to be the dominant person at the table, sort of talking about, well, this is what I think, but to get them to work cooperatively towards something. Yes, there are some good models, but I want to be careful in answering that, and not sort of try to promise the sun, because we're still trying to work through some of the challenges associated with this, especially because we can't be there in person right now. That's one of the big barriers that we have, because normally these things and the trust building exercises are done in person, and that's so difficult to do over Zoom or other sort of electronic media.
And as a note, we will be sharing both of our contact information and a follow-up email to this, and we'll be opening up a Slack channel so you can ask continual questions on these and other issues. I'm going to ask Trish's question, and then I'm going to let Bernie Smith come on either on phone or video to ask their question. So first, regarding COVID-19, what lessons, if any, should we be taking from leadership like that we're seeing in New Zealand? As vaccines will not be readily available until next year at the earliest, and subsequent deployment could be years, the US is currently facing ongoing impacts preventing normal life. So recognizing the cultural and political barriers in the US, is it worth considering New Zealand's approach of eradication over flattening the curve?
Well, I wish we could all be like New Zealand. They do have geographic advantages of being a relatively small country on 3 islands. In some ways, parts of the Arctic are also isolated, and there have been moves to sort of isolate themselves from other parts, but it's difficult. In Alaska, we do still have strict quarantine measures and testing for anyone coming to the state. They've cut out really most tourism, but commercial fishing still has to happen. That traditionally relies upon people coming into the state from outside. In my wife's hometown in northern British Columbia, they're building a pipeline. Of course, there are questions about whether the pipeline should be there in the first place, but she mentioned that, you know, her town of 3,000 people, they're bringing in 1,200 workers. They don't have any COVID cases in northern British Columbia at the moment, but what's going to happen when you bring people in from the south? So I would say that even if we could try to flatten the curve, we'd be doing better than what we're doing right now. But so many of, as I said, the here and now politics seem to get in the way of people just saying, well, we're not going to put off building the pipeline for a year. You crazy? You know, and we're not going to just push off people not fishing in Alaska. But at other times, there are decisions that we can make that are that, yeah, we just can't have cruise ships in Alaska because that would just be too nightmarish and horrific. And we can thank the Canadian government for actually having made that decision for us. But I know my friends in Juneau were really worried about that back in March. So no, and Trish, we can talk about this because we know each other offline, but it's really tough. What we need is just better leadership to say, these are the things we need to do, and not sort of prevaricate and just sort of force everything to work as if the pandemic wasn't even there.
So Bernie, I think you are unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Yes, my name is Bernie Smith. I'm a member of Commonwealth North, which is putting together a Arctic policy paper, and we meet every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. In Alaska time. So if anybody would like to join us, please do. My question to you, Chad, is the fire, last June, or just June, Siberia had over 100 degrees temperature, which basically caused more fires in Siberia than normal, I would assume. And we in Alaska on the 4th of July, in Anchorage for sure, started to see haze and smoke that was caused by this fire. Is your group looking at anything? And also, because of that fire, they had a lot of carbon dioxide released into the air. Are you looking into any studies on the high heat that we're having this summer in the Arctic area, not only in Siberia, but throughout the Arctic Circle?
Yeah, it's really worrying. And I can be thankful that we haven't had that heat here in Anchorage. Yeah, one of my students even came up with a card that was specifically talking about zombie fires. So the idea that it's not just heat, but if you have peat bogs, the fire can go out over the winter and then just spontaneously come back or the next summer. That you can have fires just starting to spread. And the level of carbon emissions that have been coming from the Arctic this year and last year have been exceptionally high, in large part because of the fires, because of the melting permafrost. Yeah, it's a background issue, meaning not just that it's not important, but you know, we could go back to 2010 and see some of the cascading impacts. So 2010, they had intense heat during that year as well in Russia. And Putin had decided as a sort of nationalist move to say that they were going to embargo all grain exports from Russia. As a consequence of that, food prices spiked in some of their export markets, particularly North Africa and the Middle East. So places like Egypt, bread prices just shot up. And that was, of course, 2010. That was the start of the Arab Spring. So, you know, and you want to be careful saying that, oh yeah, so heat in Siberia caused the Arab Spring, but it was a contributing factor. You can sort of trace how one thing leads to another and exacerbates an already existing problem in places like Egypt and Tunisia. So yeah, we want to look, traditionally, we've been looking at how changes in the Arctic affect not just other communities in the Arctic, but also how they percolate down into places further south. And yeah, what's happening in Siberia is really scary. We see those weather maps every day, and you know, even here in Anchorage, you know, they'll show the weather maps, and you can see Siberia off on the left-hand part of the screen in bright or dark red, and it's really frightening. So yes, it is something that we're monitoring because the consequences of that are extraordinary, and Russia is not very transparent about explaining what's happening in those areas. So we can't get very good visibility. That's not a pun, because I remember the haze on July 4th, but we don't know the situation very well there.
So we have another question from Priya. If you could elaborate on your n-dimensional modeling. She is looking to model disaster scenarios quantitatively, and she's wondering how you translate events in a disaster to mappable data.
Okay, I will probably, if you can email me, I will hand you off to someone who is better at that sort of quantitative modeling than I am. The idea behind n-dimensional modeling came from one of my Swedish defense colleagues, but who now works at the Swedish Stockholm Environment Institute. And the Stockholm Environment Institute does some very good work in terms of quantitative modeling of these sorts of disasters and risk, in large part because of Henrik Carlson's work. But it informed a lot of the ideas that we had about looking at essentially extremes of not trying to follow probability curves, because we understand that the probabilities probably aren't very accurate these days, that we have too much uncertainty. But yeah, please let me put you in touch with them, because they might be able to answer your questions a bit more. We are trying to model this in some of our work when we look at strategic disaster intelligence, but we're still sort of in the, and Miriam Mateova and Robert Weiss are also working on that with me, but that's a little embryonic at the moment.
And maybe just following up on that and taking my own question and putting it out there while we're waiting for a few others to come in. When you are bringing together individuals who are trained in both qualitative and quantitative data analysis, how do you bridge that divide? In the Research Coordination Network, we have biologists and ecologists, we have social scientists, we have engineers, we have local leaders, traditional knowledge holders. When you get everyone at the table for a war game to identify drivers, how do you get everyone on the same page?
It's a little difficult to explain how and why it works properly. When I first described this to my wife, who was my deputy in the Air Force team, she was really unhappy with how I described it. And I kept saying, look, we'll test it on this group of students at University College London. This is just a run through to prove to the Air Force that this is a real thing. And it sounded like popsicle sticks and bubble gum. And afterwards, you know, we came out and she's, you know, could you explain that? She's like, no, I don't. And there's something about, if you take the randomness of the process and if you have a good mix of people at the table, it forces everyone to step outside of their own expertise comfort levels and to rely upon the knowledge of the group in general. So this sort of emergent knowledge is what we're pushing for. And this is also the big challenge of doing this electronically versus at a table, but it works somehow. People will sort of step outside of their own expertise and start deferring to the group in general, because everything is just, it doesn't make sense. It's we deliberately try to make people uncomfortable in these situations, so that they will have to rely upon everyone else. And by doing that, yes, there are sometimes some dislocations. Local knowledge is not, or indigenous knowledge is not the same thing as scientific knowledge. But we found that people, if they're asked to put things together in a narrative, something that makes sense, you could communicate to others. Sometimes we have to take a second step and go back and streamline it, where we'll go back and we'll say, okay, well, we have to make sure this fits the actual scientific models, and does this really fit the bathymetry of the area that we're looking at for wave action, for example? Or, was this story that someone told is true, or was this an urban legend about the mud flats outside of Anchorage? But once we do that, then we can go back a second time and we keep refining it just a little bit better before we go to the decision process. So it does work. It's a matter of getting the right people at the table. So some of our events are more like wedding planning than the scientific conference invitation.
Well, I don't envy you on that, although I'm looking forward to our wedding planning for next year in our 2021 workshop that we will be hosting in Anchorage, which I hope all of you will apply to join us at. I'm going to call Amy Lauren Lovecraft on to video or phone to ask her question.
Hey, yeah. Hey, Chad, this has been a great discussion. I know that this summer you ran your class that had scenarios in it, and I did the same thing in my class up here for the One Health project, though we do things quite differently. And I was just curious if I know you're getting used to Alaska and working with all of us. So from your experience and then your work with the students this summer, how do you grapple with the different types of Arctic security that the different student and other people, right, perspectives bring? We talked about this a little bit when you were kind enough to come up to UAF and lecture, and I'm still thinking about that a lot. Like, how do we compare total military security of the nation to that fishing security, in a smaller location, or how, students just, most of them, right, completely discount the sort of classic public good, right, that we're defended, and they really have to think about economic security. And so just with all your information, how do we talk about different kinds of Arctic security in ways that don't divide us, but that prepare us better for the future? So I'm sorry if this seems a bit out of left field, but I just am really curious how you happen to tackle that kind of question.
Well, in the course, I would talk about the different types of security that we could look at in the Arctic. And there were like 7 or 8 different potential types. But hypothetically, that was just still hypothetical, right? And people knew that you could look from different perspectives at the same issue and come to different conclusions. What we found is that going through the actual experience of the war game, where they just have to make decisions, where it's kind of role-playing based, so they have to play a different role, and then one group is going to represent the military, another group the state, municipality of Anchorage, native groups. Then in the after action report, when we do the debriefing, we looked at, okay, what actually happened? Then you can start piecing apart and saying, what part of security were you actually trying to defend? And where did they come in conflict with one another? Because the military would take actions that might undercut what was happening for economic security for the municipality, because they were, trying to hoard all the fuel, and they were taking actions, and they weren't diverting resources because they had their own priorities. Or people were focusing on economic security and looking mostly at Anchorage because that was the center, and then forgetting what was happening in the villages. Or they were forgetting specific groups. There were vulnerable groups. So they would have ideas of food security, but they would forget that certain people couldn't leave their houses, or that they'd have to look for disabled groups, or right. So it was in the debriefing where you could go back and you could start pointing out, okay, this is how this decision led to this particular outcome. And you were focusing on this type of security, but that undercut this other type of security. So we could look at the contradictions and at times correlations between the different types. That made it a little more real for the students, I think, than just talking about, okay, well, here's energy security, here's environment security, here's military security. It's not perfect, but I think it gave a little bit more illustration of, you know, how we try to make that real for them.
Do you think that in that debriefing, they thought that, in particularly playing the roles, you know, as you just really explained well, do they think they might make different decisions? In other words, do you think they're, with that debriefing, they go back and look at those different perspectives differently? You know what I'm saying? Or do you think that the debriefings of, I mean, I know this is putting a lot on just, you know, the one time you've taught this here at Alaska right now, but I'm just curious, is that debriefing, do you think, a tension de-escalator? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I would hope it was.
Yeah.
I mean, the student who played the governor, I did ask her if this made her more sympathetic to Dunleavy. She said no. But they did go back and say, yes, I would have made different decisions because I didn't realize that taking this action early on meant that something else was going to happen. Or I didn't understand that we needed to develop food security issues from the very beginning, as opposed to waiting until it became a crisis. And we can also go through and understand what parts we thought were unrealistic. So we could even say that, okay, I understand that I was giving FEMA an unlimited budget. That's completely unrealistic. We didn't look at, you know, people in the White House stealing medical supplies, or we didn't look at, you know, political interference in this area. The military understood that they were being more generous to the civilians than would have happened in real life. But yeah, I think it gave them an opportunity at least to be retrospective. But like I said, this was sort of a trial run, and everyone was still dealing with, you know, everyday crises at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, I just think it all speaks to working collaboratively across the state and with different partners to talk about, you know, different possible futures, you know, for those reasons you just mentioned, that by better, you know, through better understanding of these different perspectives, we might avoid a lot of complications when future disasters or issues come to us. So, thanks, Chad.
So with just under 10 minutes to go, and I don't see any other questions or hand raises, I think the final question that I would like to ask are your thoughts on why joining the Migration and Harmony Research Coordination Network is important. And maybe here you can talk a bit about your vision for our 2021 Alaska workshop and the importance of why the 120 people that joined us today should be engaged in person or virtually in 2021 for thinking about disaster response in a moving Arctic.
This is the cool club to join. You want to be part of whatever Victoria is part of. No, but I am actually partly serious. No, this is a really great opportunity for people. I know there are different organizations and research networks. I would say that this is a chance to feel like you're doing something applied. The motivation behind what we did originally with the Department of Energy and then continued with the Air Force was that we kept finding that a lot of people were frustrated that they weren't being listened to, that the traditional modes of communication, so whether it was someone who lived in a village and could never get the local news media to pay attention, whether it was someone at a university who was a grad student or junior faculty, and they just had to do everything to get tenure, but what they were really interested in was stuff they couldn't publish about. All of that was such important knowledge that was being untapped. And what we tried to do was to develop a process by which people could really contribute where it wasn't the typical kind of venue where you say, okay, well, this has to be put into a formal model or else we're just not going to look at it, but rather to say, okay, look, I'm an expert in this, but I also know just from my experience fishing in this area that, you know, the salmon just don't look the same. Is this an issue that relates to hotter water, or what's the issue? And then there will be someone else in the network who can answer those questions. And if we set up the framework properly, where not only can you have your questions answered, but can be put into a larger framework that then can be communicated in terms of warning and saying, these are the potential futures we have. These are things we should really worry about. And then here are the other sets of potential futures that we want. And we can set out a chart for how we get there, for what needs to be done, who needs to be responsible, what decisions we need to make, what uncertainties we have, and what sort of research we need to do now in order to get to that better future.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much.
And Anchorage is a great place. So you will, hopefully everything will look much better with the pandemic by next year, but.
I think most people on this call can confirm Anchorage is a great place. I have included the link to join the Research Coordination Network in the chat. In addition to the Anchorage workshop in 2021, we'll also be holding a workshop in Sweden in 2022 and here in Washington, D.C. in 2023. We also have about 10 upcoming other webinars, and we publish animated videos and infographics on the many dimensions of an Arctic in motion. So if you sign up for our network, you get lots of cool opportunities to hang out with Chad and I, but also some very informative multimedia posts and opportunities to hear from other experts in our network. And I'm going to plug here at the end of this webinar, our next webinar on July 29th at 2 p.m. Chad mentioned food security and the importance of considering how supply chains get disrupted in disasters. And that's what we will be focusing on July 29th with our steering committee member, Brett Verheusen, who has worked to build a coalition with the nation's preeminent fisheries, seafood, and disease experts to develop rigorous health and safety standards to protect vulnerable Alaskan communities and essential seafood workers against COVID-19. He'll be sharing some of those examples and how seafood supply chains from grocer to restaurant to shipping can come around a common policy goal through coalition building. He'll be coming at us from Homer, Alaska. And again, that's on July 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, the same time as this webinar. And I've also included that in the chat. As a reminder, we will have a recording of this webinar emailed out to everyone who is registered, and that email will include both Chad and my email addresses, so you can reach out to us with any additional questions or ways that you want to get involved. But for now, please again join me in a virtual round of applause for an incredible presentation and a really meaningful discussion over the last 50 minutes with Dr. Briggs. Thank you, Chad, for a really wonderful hour and a half spent with the 120 of us that joined in from Yellowknife to Juneau. And I hope that we see everyone on June 29th. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, Victoria.
Bye, everyone.